right. Okay, so guys, hope we had a wonderful day. We're back again today to discuss JavaScript and ES6 features. Okay, so by the way, if you can hear me, I can see we just have 8 of you here. Probably more people will be joining us soon. Please go ahead and drop a message in the chat. Let me know if you can hear me so that we can proceed already. Okay. All right. Hello, Ikechuku. Good evening, guys. All right. So let me know if you can hear me. All right. Um, all right. Hi, Eliza and Taiwo. Okay. Okay. So I can see your messages. Nice. I believe we can start. And yes, I also believe most of you have been you know uh, you guys have been joining like the previous classes. I got some feedback from the last workshop. You guys loved it, and we'll try as much as possible to keep up with that. That setup, right? That process of setting up the workshop to go live on YouTube rather than Discord. Okay, so we've actually looked into a couple of topics when it comes to learning JavaScript, and today um, we're going to be covering ECMAScript, right, which is what we also call ES6, right? And some of the things we're going to be looking at, of course, would range from, let and const, right? These are some of the features that were introduced, rather than the regular var option for creating variables, right? So we have let, we have const. We have actually covered some of these things already, so it's more like a revision, and we're not going to dive so deep into them, okay? For the areas that we haven't, done a lot of, explanation, I will take out, some time to like explain some details about them, right? Something like destructuring. We've not really dived so deep into destructuring, right? Um, yeah, so we basically have object literals, just like what we have here. We have discussed promises in the past, resolve, reject, right? Um, Sorry, 1 minute. Don't know where this is coming from. Okay, so we've actually discussed classes, right? So this material will be shared with you. Remember, after the class, this material will be shared with you. We're going to be looking at modules, basically, working with additional files, importing. I'll show you different patterns, even down to working with what we call, common JS, and of course, using this import and export, patterns, right? We'll discuss spread operator, right? If you haven't used spread operator before, we'll discuss that. We'll also discuss uh, yeah, I don't want us to dive so deep into like this reduce function. Reason for that is because we have other areas where we need to actually cover it, right, when we start working on backend development. And yeah, so these are some of the things we're going to cover today, right? Exponentiation operator, where we also have this. I think I've also explained this before when we discussed arithmetic operator, I believe. We've also discussed async await, right? So some of these things are, things you've already come across in our previous classes, but we'll try as much as possible to just, quickly glance through them, right? So let's start from the first one here. We have let and, const. I don't think I need to explain this already because I don't need to explain this because the document, explains it already, right? So the point is that we are able to reassign the values of count right here because we're using the let keyword, for the declaration. Basically, the let is used for block scoped variables that can be reassigned. And when we're using const, which is constant in JavaScript, this particular variable cannot be reassigned to a new value because it's meant to be constant. Okay, so these are some things we've tried already, right? If I pull up my terminal from here, let's just go into Node. I think we can first navigate to that that part. I think that should be note 3, all right? So not there, but here, note 3, yeah. All right, so if I simply execute this, all right, so we have, let's clear. If I try to assign a new value to pi, right? So let's assume I say hello, right? For example, right? So if we try to run this, you see we have an error and it says assignment to constant variable. So this is the error, right? This is the type of the error. That's what that's the problem that we're having here. We can't perform this assignment because it's a constant, right? So we've actually covered this before, and I believe that is fairly straightforward. If you have any questions, do well to ask those questions in the chat. I'm looking at the chat. When we talk about writing concise functions with arrow functions just like this, we've also covered this in the past, right? Yeah, so we've actually covered this in the past. And if you also have any questions, or maybe there's something you don't understand, just feel free to drop that question in the chat. Okay, I'm also going to ask us to drop like a reminder in your WhatsApp group and on Discord server. Let's do that for the first, let's do that for just about 2 minutes so that we can have others join. Okay, so please go ahead and drop, that, reminder. Okay, let's do that for 2 minutes. 2 minutes, please. Thank you. All right. Let's see. I believe. So can you move your call icon from the bottom? It's blocking the output. Oh, I see. Okay. How about I take it off completely? Yeah. All right. Thank you, Ikechukwu. So I believe you can see my screen, and we can continue. In regards to the let function, what would happen if instead of count, it was count equals string? Let me try to get your question. So if I should move this, okay, so your question is what would happen if this was a string? More like this. Is that what you are asking? I mean, what you are basically doing is, of course, JavaScript would give you the ability to perform some kind of crazy, addition here. But at the end of the day, what we are trying to prove here is the fact that, this you can reassign a new value, right? That's what we're trying to prove here. It's not actually like the arithmetic operation itself, right? We're trying to prove that you can reassign. So I can also change this, like to count equals 10. Do you understand? That's what we're trying to prove here. So it's not about the arithmetic operation that is actually happening. It's more about the reassignment of a new value, right, based on the operation that actually took place here. Okay, Kobe. Hope that makes sense, right? And I mean, if you're asking what would happen if we actually just reassign a string, right? If it would be successful, or if we would have an error. So you see, I mean, JavaScript basically picks this item and it assumes, right, this is meant to be a 1, right? And you're trying to perform, an addition between a number and another number. That's just an assumption. So it's able to, perform that, operation. Now, this is technically correct because at the end of the day, the value you get here is because you can simply perform this kind of operation in JavaScript, right? So even if you say 19, then yes, that's also technically correct, right? Because this string is being added to this item. In terms of if it is valid arithmetically, this is definitely wrong, right? What you're just having here is this one is being appended to 91, making it 191. So this is not very correct in terms of arithmetic. Okay, it's not correct. I won't say very correct. It's not correct. But is it possible in JavaScript? Yes, it is. So that's why you have to be careful, when you write your code. Um, yeah. So let's come back to this. I hope that answers your question, Kobe. Let's see. Do we have any other question in the chat? I don't think so. All right. So we've also covered arrow function before. So now you see we have a simple arrow function here. We have const add equals. This is basically our parameters, right? We're passing in a or b, and the output is to basically return a plus b, right? So which means we can simply say add, and you see at this point we can pass in the values like 5 and 5. So we can say maybe let results, or we can just console.log directly in here, right? So this is basically how we work with arrow functions. We don't need to have the pair of braces, right? Just like when you're creating a regular function. So instead of doing something like this, where you have a comma b, let's change this to add sample. Okay, so instead of doing something like this, you can just go ahead and work with the arrow function, because you're sure that your operation here is going to be a one-liner, right? So this can actually give you a short form of writing functions, right? Functions that are meant to perform very simple actions, right? And yeah, I mean, it makes sense. So we've covered this before, I believe. We've covered this before, and if you have any questions as to, like maybe use cases or scenarios where you might find yourself using this, do well to ask those kind of questions in the chat, so we can also, brainstorm and come up with something, right? Yeah, let's see. Before I move on, if we have any other question, please, yeah, raise those questions so we can take them. Okay, so I'm assuming we do not have any question. All right, then let's proceed. So let's move on to the next template literal. We've actually covered this as well before, if you remember. Let's take that again. So here we have a simple, we have a simple snippet here, simple code snippet. We have const name equals world, right? This can be anything. It can be math, okay? And now we say console.log. We're using the template literal here, which is this sign right here. Okay, so and this would give us the ability to append variables, right? So we're able to append variables in here, just like the way we did this. And of course we can also add some additional text. Now let's write a more reasonable example. So I'll give an assumption here. We are trying to, we have a class, or we have let's say we have a code base that we're able to use that code to accept employee information, right? Employee record. So quick one, I have a class employee, right? And then we have a constructor here with the name, right? So let's say we have first name and we have last name. Okay, that's the employee information here. Okay, so I'm simply going to, let's just say this dot first name equals first name, and this dot last name equals last name. Okay, so right here I'm going to say get, I think I forgot the equals sign there. So equals. So I'm going to say, employee dot full name, for example. Okay, and for the full name, I want to simply return this dot first name and this dot last name, right? So we can use the template literal here, put this within, yeah, so this dot first name, and I can of course add some space. I don't need the plus because we're using template literal, so add a little bit of space and we'll say this dot last name, right? So that basically would make up the full name, right? So if I come in here to say const, let's just say let's employee one equals a new employee, right? So this is the point where I put in the first name and the last name. So let's just say Mav, and we have magic. So now I passed into two strings, first name and last name, but I can also just go ahead to say employee dot full name. right? Because now I can use that to get the full name. So if I do console.log employee.full name, employee1.full name, this will basically give me, the full name, magic, right? So we're able to simply do this with a string literal. Of course, you can use the direct, concatenation, string concatenation, but this makes sense because it keeps, that code clean, right? It keeps that code clean. Okay, so let me expand this and let's take a look at the next thing we have here. Let's see, what do we have here? All right, so destructuring assignments, right? So this will basically allow us to unpack values from arrays or properties of objects. So it's basically for unpacking. When we say unpacking, you actually have a value in there already. I am not keeping this sample code because it's more like a revision. We've covered most of these things. Um, yeah, so I don't think I need to keep them. All right, so we have a simple, we have this A and B, and we're basically assigning this to, 1 and 2. This means if I say console.log A, the expectation here is that that should, hold the value of A, which is 1, right? So we're basically doing some mapping here. A refers to 1 and B refers to 2. Of course, if you have like 3, then you can also go ahead and say, okay, we have another variable C, which should refer to 3. So if I should simply log the value of C, you're going to see we have 3, right? Does that make sense? Are we following? Please let me know if you're confused about this. We're basically doing some mapping here. We have an array of values, and we're simply trying to assign each and every one of those arrays to some variables, right? And we can simply create an array of variables. This will automatically create that mapping, right? So A, the first variable there maps to the first value, and it performs that mapping up to the last item. Okay. So, all right, thank you. So that's Allah Sukami. Thank you. So let's move on. We have another example, by the way. So this will basically perform, object um, destructuring. So we have, yeah. So if you look at this right now, we have an object, we have a key and a key value pair. So X, maps to 10, Y maps to 20, and now we have const with the uh, yeah, we have X and Y, right? So this is also an object, but basically it's performing that, that X and Y mapping to the values of X and Y right here. Okay, so if I go ahead and say console.log, by the way, you must not use X and Y. Okay, you can actually use something else. It must not be X and Y, right? So now you see X gives us the value of 10, Y gives us the value of 20. So basically, this would give us, the value of that, specific key, right? So that is what happens here. Just take note of that. This is basically, object destructuring. All right. So let's look at this. We have enhanced object literal. By the way, if you have any questions, let's take your question before I move on. All right. Let's take any question. 1 minute before we move on to enhanced object literals. Okay. All right, so I don't think we have any questions. So right here we have enhanced object literal. So make sure you read through the description. I tried my best to make it, to keep it short and straight to the point. So enhanced object literal. So this would give you a shorthand syntax for initializing properties and defining methods, right? So if you take a look at this, you see what we've basically achieved from here. If you log, let's log object, so you see what I mean. If I say console.log, and we basically log object, let's run that. Okay, so if we run that object now, you see this is basically giving us, function, right within that object declaration. This is an object, by the way. Take note. Okay, if you format this, um, let's format this. Okay, I was hoping I could just I was hoping this would basically pop up this way, yeah. So because that is basically what it is, right? It's an object. So you see that's an object. Let's do this. Okay. Can I format again? All right. So that is basically an object. This is what someone said. Sir, can you explain the for loop? What for? Are you referring to? okay, like how to use a for loop, because we have not mentioned for loop here. But if that's what you mean, then yeah, probably when we're done with this, I can go back to that, Taiwo, right? Okay, so but we have an example. I don't know if you're following with this material. So I believe if you check note one, is it note one? Yeah, then you check number five here, which is control flow. You would find that for loop, even with the definition and example. Okay, have you done that already, Taiwo? Did you do that already and you're still not getting it? Let me know. Okay, so yeah, so you basically notice that we have that method in here. So this is the method. It's basically a function that we've created within this object. And what we have done is we're able to define an object. We're able to also define the values x and y, and we also have a method that we can use for performing performing some sort of function or calculation, right, within that method. Okay, so how do we go about working with this? Now let's do it this way. Now we have const x equals 10, y equals 20, right? So if you go ahead to say I want to perform a specific action, someone said no, sir. Okay, so does that mean you? Okay, I think when you say no, it means you did not. I hope I'm not making a mistake. Well, it means you did not go through the file already, right? So I think you should, right? I think you should. Okay. So yeah, take out some time to go through the file. I believe it actually explains, that it actually explains it with some examples. So do that. All right. So what you're seeing here is that we now have objects, right? We've passed in, x and y, and if we proceed to call object.method, let's do that, and let's execute this. So you're going to see it gives us 30, which is the output of that addition, right? So we're able to actually do our definition right here, right on top. And you see we actually use a single line for doing our definition, right? So const x equals 10, y equals 20. So we actually define the variable and initialized it right there. Two variables, of course we can even have more, right? And then we simply pass that value into the object, and the object itself. Within the object itself, we perform the mathematical operation within the method, right? So once we say object of method, it basically performs. It basically takes that input, which is 10 and 20, right, which is what we have here, and it will proceed to perform that computation, thereby giving us the output of 30. All right. So do we have any questions before I proceed? Taiwo, please do that. Right, make sure you do that. I think that would make it easier for you instead of having us, go back. Um, yeah. So now this is a promise, right? Something we've covered already as well when we discussed, asynchronous functions. So basically, a promise represents an eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation, right? So the idea is, okay, I want this guy to basically run in the background while I can proceed to do some other things, right? So when it's done, let me know if it completes, right? Based on this check. So if it's going to resolve, if it is rejected, we're going to get that feedback, as a callback, right? So we actually covered this and I discussed extensively about it. Please check that video, check that class. You'll see different ways of working with asynchronous functions, with promises, callbacks, as well as with async await. Okay, so check that video. So we don't have to dive into that here. Classes. Yes, we've actually covered a couple of things around classes. We even went as far as discussing some other OOP principles, right? Aggregation, right? We discussed some of those. We discussed composition. So please, if you were not in that class, also do well to review that class video, right? It will make it easier for you to understand how to work with classes. Okay, so you know what a constructor is, you know what the methods are, right? Yeah, so by the way, the class itself is a syntactic sugar over JavaScript prototype-based inheritance, which is what I also explained that day with an example, right, where I showed you that you can actually use prototype, the prototype, option to include, or append new functions to an existing, constructor function that you've created, right? So using a class makes it easier, not just for yourself, but even other developers trying to understand what you're trying to build, right, with that OOP pattern. Yeah, and of course, it also makes your code familiar to other people coming from, other high-level languages, right? Because this will be familiar. This pattern will be familiar to them, rather than using the function constructor and prototype chains, right? So yes, we actually covered
Hello, Map. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I'm back. Apologies, my network tripped. Yeah, so I had to quickly switch to a different provider. Apologies.
Ah,
Um, yeah. All right. Yeah. Sorry, guys. I hope you can. I hope you can still see my screen. Let's proceed. So I was. Oh yeah, Bernard. It was from my end. Okay. So I was basically describing, some of the things we've, covered when it comes to working with, classes, right? So yeah, if you have any questions regarding the previous classes, the things we discussed when it comes to JavaScript class, inheritance, encapsulation, and all those stuff, do well to raise your questions in the chat right away, please. Okay. Okay, so two things I'm going to mention here that I believe a lot of people might not have paid attention to was working with static methods, right? Sometimes you probably want to create a class without specifically saying I want to use this class as blueprints for object initialization, right? Sometimes maybe just maybe all you want is you want a situation where you can just call that particular class and use it to create some or probably call some methods, some static methods. Static methods are methods that you would probably use for performing some actions without necessarily having to initialize the class itself, right? So yeah, without necessarily having to initialize the class. So I want to show us an example, maybe like a simple scenario where we probably want to create a class to perform some operations without necessarily including a constructor. Okay, so let's do that. Now let's assume you have a person class. You're building a real application here. You have a person class, and you want to be able to do things like validate the person's email, right? Yeah, you want to be able to validate the person's email, perform some, I don't know, maybe perform some other kind of actions yeah, things like submitting the person's record, maybe via a form or something, right? I'm going to show you how we can, attempt to do something like that. So let's just go ahead and create a simple class. So person, remember, it's a good practice to use capital letters for your class name. And I'm going to simply have a static method here. So I start with static, and I'm going to have, let's call that validate email, right? So here I'm going to accept an email. Now, if you look at this right now, I don't have a constructor, which means I don't need to come and say, const person equals new person. I don't have to do that because I don't have a constructor, right? So you see, there's nothing to basically, construct from the person object right here. Okay, so I don't need this. Instead, I can just go ahead when I put the dot notation here. You see, I get validate email. I have direct access to performing that validation, and I don't need the new keyword either, right? So I have the ability to perform that validation. Now, one nice thing here is I think I can simply try to get the regular expression for performing validation, right? So I'm going to grab that from Google. I just did that search. So forget about this. We did not really dive into the details of regular expression yet, but what I'm simply trying to do with this is to perform email validation. I'm going to add a sample email. So let's say is valid, right? So I'm going to simply say person.validate email, and let's pass in maybe me at solomonmarvel.com. All right, so let's console.log is valid. Okay, so if I should run this, now this is going to tell us whether the email is valid or not. What if I do me at .com? What about that? What do we get? We get false. So that's to say, okay, the email is not valid. Now, you see the way we're able to construct this. By the way, person can be user, it can be something else, it can be user, right? So let's change this to user. In a real application that you're building, it makes sense to say, oh, we're trying to create new users, right? We want to see if the user information right there is valid, right? If it's not valid, this is what we want to do. So a perfect scenario would be maybe you want to do something like if I say is valid, if I say validate email, if there's an error, I want to probably crash or throw some error, right? So I can go ahead and say if this, right? So now I'm sure you might be wondering, okay, what is this going to return? Now, the thing is, if you're checking for this, it means we're trying to check for this scenario where this is true, right? I did not specify, but of course you can specify. I did not specify because by default it's going to check if this is true. So I can simply say, if this is true, just return true, right? Okay, so I mean, nothing complex there. It's pretty basic, right? Now this is false, so that's why you see we have undefined because the value we put in here is not really valid. So if I change that back to Solomon marvel.com, which is a valid email, you see we get true, right? If it's invalid, we get undefined because we did not really specify what happens when it's not valid. So here we can say else, maybe return false, or I can say return the email is invalid. Does that make sense? Let's go ahead and run this again. So now we get the email is invalid. Let's put Solomon marvel.com. Run this again. We get true. So at this point, we can also return something different. We can say the email is valid, right? Okay. So I hope that makes sense. So if I run this again, the email is valid. Now, one thing we could actually do is to perform some, chaining where we get something like this, console.log this, and then we'll return this. Now, remember, I taught you that if you're trying to do some kind of chaining in the last class, we mentioned that you can proceed to return that this object, right? So where you can say user.validate email.save, right? If the email is valid, go ahead and probably save. That is if you also maybe you have a static method for that as well. So if you have a static method for save record, okay, so now we're trying to save the record. Probably want to pass in the email as well. I mean, if there's a different thing here, you probably say, okay, I don't want to pass in the email. I want to have a constructor this time around where I can pass in the email here. And I can say this.email equals email. Now, what we're doing here is I'm trying to teach you how to basically, think through using objects to create, that pattern, so I can simply say this.email. Now, this makes sense. We've created a constructor. It means when we're creating an instance here, this is the pointer we have to say new, right? And now we have said, okay, a new user. So all we have to pass in first would be the email, right? So now that we've passed in the email, we can now proceed to perform .validate email, right? Now, if email is valid, we can go ahead to say .save record, okay? So I hope this makes sense to you. I hope this is not confusing anybody here because I don't want to confuse you, okay? But I remember teaching you this pattern in the last class, and it makes sense because now you can basically think through your application as a series of actions that are being performed, right? So we've created a new user, we'll perform the validation, and if it's not valid, at this point, of course, we can basically console this as well, and then instead of returning this, we can throw, right? We can throw what we call, and we can say an error, or the email does not meet validation requirements. Okay, so I hope this makes sense to you. If it doesn't make any sense, don't worry. I believe you would get. You can drop your questions if this is confusing you. So this is the point where we can say, okay, we just save the record. So the record was saved, right? And it makes sense if we also say console.log this, right? So the record was saved. So yeah, I mean, if you go ahead to say this is where you're basically creating, let's see, what do I have here? So we're creating a new user. So let's call this user one, right? So we can proceed to say user one dot validate email. Let's verify that. Okay. And after validating the email, we then proceed to also save the record. Yeah. So let me look at the charts. I'm sure you guys have some questions already. So honestly, this JS is difficult for me to understand. I have gone through the videos repeatedly, and still, it's still overwhelming me. I don't know how best to learn this JS, and I won't give up at all. All right, so you could share areas you don't understand. Yeah, I mean, always share those areas. I'm wondering, looking at your comments, because I've also mentioned that whenever you have questions, feel free to drop it in the chat. Feel free to ask me on Discord. But as for the pattern I'm trying to show you here, I'm trying to show you how you can, realistically apply a class into a process, a business process, right? Something you would find yourself doing in actual, reality. It's not creating employee class here and there, but trying to apply the concept of classes into solving problems. Now, this is an example use case where we create a new user. Of course, you might have more details like email and password and all that, right? You want to encrypt the password, or you want to hash the password. Then you want to perform email validation, right? Probably want to send an email to see if that email actually exists. You also want to save records, right? So this is a way you can basically compose different actions within a single entity called the user class, right? And eventually it makes sense that you are able to say something like user one dot validate the email, and if the email is valid, then of course go ahead and save the record. If it's invalid, then we throw an error, and once we throw an error, we have terminated that execution, right? So I hope that makes sense to you. Yeah, we'll probably experiment with this even better later, right? Because so now it says user one dot validate email is not a function. Yes, because as I mentioned the other time, we're trying to perform this from a static method. So remember, right? If you have decided to go with this pattern, then you probably don't want to use static. If you're using static, it means I am working with a class, and I can simply call that class like user dot validate. If I'm using a static method, I can just call user dot validate without necessarily performing that initialization. Here we added a constructor, we perform that initialization, which is the major reason why we simply want to work with this pattern, right? So now that you have user one dot validate, let's see, we have an error. It says is invalid, is not defined, and that is correct because it is not defined. We changed that already, remember. Okay, so we changed that already, so we have to delete that line of code. So now you see it says the email is valid and the record was saved. If I pass in one that is not valid, so it throws that error, and the error, it says the email is invalid, so the record obviously was not saved. Does that make sense? If that makes sense to you, drop a message in the chat. I want to see, is there going to be a class on optimizing websites for better performance and speed? Yeah, I mean, those classes will definitely come up towards the end of the program, teach you how to use a bunch of tools for performing those kind of, optimizations. What else do we have here? Let's see. Okay, also approaches to real world code problems method. I mean, I don't know if you have been seeing, if you have been looking at the screen. But if you are, I'm also mentioning a couple of things that I think would be helpful to you. So, yes. Now, looking at our curriculum, we have a lot of things. We have a long way to go. We have so many things to actually look into. We'll get to cover most of these things. So, when we get there, I'm sure you would notice that. Okay, so I believe we have actually looked into this. The next thing I have here would be modules, right? So we have a lot of things to cover as regards modules. I don't know if anybody would be needing this code base here, but probably just create a new file. Let's create a new file. Okay, let's create a new file, file 2. Okay, and of course the naming conventions are quite weird, but I'll try as much as possible to rename some of these things and make it even easier to follow up with the with the class files. Okay, so let me also expand, close this. All right, so working with modules. Now, basically, when you create multiple JavaScript files, what you have in a JavaScript file like this is referred to as a module, right? So we can have like a set of code in a single file and then perform an export, right? So that we can allow other JavaScript files to import the function, right? Or the constants or the variables, right? That you have created in the first file. All right, so let's do it this way. Look at the sample code we have here. All right, so we have a sample code here. I'm also going to show you, how this is, done. Maybe if you are, I mean, when we get to, use Node.js, you would explore that even more, right? So you would find some projects where they do things like we call it CommonJS, right? CommonJS pattern. So where you can basically have something like, let's say, a function called hello world. Okay, so this is a function called hello world. Let's use something more practical. So we have a function called greeting, and then we pass in the greeting. So it's greets, and then we pass in the greeting. So within this function, we just want to return maybe hello with the greeting, right? If it's morning or afternoon, it will be like maybe good morning. Let's say good morning. So here we have the greeting. Okay, the greeting. All right, so which means I can simply say greet morning, right? So something like this. Okay, so return or probably console.log. Okay, so this would say good morning. If we say afternoon, this would say good afternoon. Okay, so basically what we have here is a function that performs this greeting. And if you want to export this particular function, if you're working with CommonJS, you want to probably do module.export, right? And then you want to pass in that greets function, right? Or you probably want to pass it in like this. Okay, so if you have like multiple functions, let's say greet, let's say call, right? And I have like call right here, maybe with a phone number. So you want to perform like a call. I'm just giving an assumption, by the way, right? So now we have two functions here, call and greet. So we can simply pass in greet and call. Now this is when you're working with a common JS pattern, this is what you will do. Following ES6, we now have the option to basically use import and export, basically to achieve the same thing, right? But this gives us a clearer definition of saying we're exporting or we're importing something, right? So if you are trying to import, by the way, so this is how you export in that current file. When you're trying to import in the new file, what you simply have to do when working with CommonJS, we can simply say const, and then we can pass in what we're trying to import, just like this. We have to require that particular file, right? We have to require that particular file. Now, this is when you are working with CommonJS. Okay, so let's also say CommonJS import. All right, so I think I want to give us that the two options. So this is CommonJS export. Okay, so we basically created two functions, and we were able to export those two functions with this command, with this code, and of course import those two functions with this code right here by using the require keyword. When you're working with ES6, So this is basically what you would do instead. So I would say ES6, right, for exports. Okay, so let's call that ES6 exports. Okay, so we export this way, and we're able to export a constant as well as export a function. So you see, in order to export the function here, we basically created module.export, and right here we're simply appending export directly to the function. Okay, and yeah, we're able to import this way, right? So we did not use the require, but we're using import the constant and then the function from this, right? So let's say this is import in ES6. All right, go ahead, drop your questions. I want to take some of your questions because time is fast spent already. Let me take a look at the charts for questions. All right. All right, please drop your questions if you have any, so we can take them real quick. Okay, so I don't think we have any questions for now. Let's move on to the next, which is a spread operator. I'm going to save this, right, so that you guys can check that. But of course, the examples and the explanations here, speaks to all this already. I'm just going to create a new file here. I would call that spread operator.js, all right, and I would also rename the others afterwards. So spread operator.js. Okay, so what exactly is the spread operator, used for? From our definition here, so this basically allows an iterable to be expanded where arguments or elements are expected, right? So let's quickly copy this example and just try to look at what is going on here. Now we have an array of numbers, right? 1, 2, 3, and we say more numbers equals. So we're using the spread operator, which is basically what you're seeing here, dots, dots, dots. And when we call nums, it's basically going to pick all the items in here and spread that into the new array that we have here. So now we have the values of nums, which is 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we also have 5, right? This is part of the new array, and this is being, collected from the previous array. So at the end of the day, when you print more nums, console.log, more norms. Let's see. So this is going to end up giving us, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I mean, it's pretty, yeah, that is the wrong file. So node spread operator.js. Now you see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is, the spread operator right here. Spreading the value you have in here into the new, array created. All right. So I hope that makes sense. Let me look at the chart. If we have any questions. All right, so it's exciting. It is looking like React.js now. Thank you. Okay, no, we haven't gotten to that, so please, yeah, it's not looking like React.js just yet. Okay, uh, what else? So was it saved? Promise, I don't think I understand what WHR stands for, except that was a mistake, right? Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so let's continue. All right, so if you're looking at the next thing I have here, so this is the this basically represents an infinite number of arguments as an array, but I actually want us to, okay, let's look at it from here. So if I should paste this, let me leave the spread operator, probably create a new file again. I pretty much, I don't like creating new files for every single explanation, but yeah, rest parameters, okay, .js. What this is basically trying to show is that you have the ability to add like infinite parameters, right? When you create a function, with such parameter, you have the ability to include infinite numbers of parameters. Now the thing about this is you can then use a reduce function. This is a reduce function, right? What we're basically doing here with the reduce function is we're just basically mapping everything in here and we're trying to perform that summation. But I want us to look into this in detail, right, in a different class, because I really want to cover map, map and reduce, right? probably map, reduce, and filter. So we have a class dedicated for that later, which is why I haven't, tried to dive into speaking about reduce, right? These are basically adopted, especially in the functional programming patterns, and it makes a lot of sense to really understand the detail, right? Instead of quickly trying to glance through, the concept of map, reduce, and filter here, it's better to actually take that in a different class entirely. Okay, so these are some additional, methods that were included in EX7, right? ECMAScript 2016 array.prototype.include, which is basically going to perform a check, right, to see if a particular value is included in an array that you have already defined, right? So whether you have defined this array or you're probably downloading this, maybe you are getting this from a request, you make an API call to like a backend server, for example, and it returns a value. Now you don't know the content of the value, but you really want to check if something is actually included within that value. Then you can actually use this to say, okay, we're expecting to check if maybe marvelous, right, is included. So is it included, right? Can you do that check and tell us, if it's included? Let's just do that here. So if I should run this, for example, let's see. Um, let's just take this back to the main file instead. So what I would do right here is just let's drop it there. Okay. So if I should run this node main, so let's look at what we get. Okay. So by the way, we are still having this throw an error. Remember, so I have to comment on this. It was an intentional error, by the way. So let's run this again. All right, so now it says true because 2 is right in there. Let's change that to 5. Let's run this again. All right, so now you see we have false because the value 2 is not included in that array. So this is a very simple pattern. Instead of trying to do some loops and check with if conditionals, you can simply use the dot include. It's a shorthand, right? And it makes life easier for some of us JavaScript developers. Instead of doing those checks and loops here and there, you can just use the dot includes to help you do that check. And it can also work for string types, not just numbers. So we have the exponential operator, right? So where you have the you know this is the asterisk. Okay, so double asterisk, right? So this was also included in EX7. So we have some other patterns or features included in ES8, such as async await. We've already covered async await in our previous class, right? Um, we have these objects dot values and objects dot entries. I have actually remembered, using this several times, especially when I'm working with code base that has like multiple nested objects, right? So this is basically going to return an object enumerable property value and the key value pairs as well. So now we have const objects, which contains the value of a, the key a with the value of 1, and the key b with the value of 2. Now when we say object.values object, this is basically going to give us the values, right, in form of an array, right? And now when we say object.entries, it's basically going to give us the key value pairs, right, in the form of an array, of course, a nested array. So you might be asking yourself, oh, when is this actually useful? If you're trying to do things around maybe role-based, access management, right? If you're writing code that has to do with role checks, maybe a user has like multiple roles. This is actually very helpful, right? Because you can simply use this to do some checks. So I'll give an example. So let's take a look at this example. Let's assume you have an object, a user object, right? So we have user, for example, and then right here we have like role. So a user basically has like I would say first name, right? So first name, Mav, some other details, right? Then we have rows, and maybe the rows then have something like this, okay? And each row probably has I don't know, let's say auth. This is another example, right? Probably invalid. Okay, let's see. So there's an object, we have auth, and auth probably gives us what are the actions. So we have maybe we have like read, we have updates, right? So this is just me making up, a simple object, right? I'm just making this up, by the way, so don't take this object very seriously. If I now proceed to say, okay, at this point, I really want to understand, like the values contained within, rows. If I have multiple modules and permissions. This is a module, right? This is an example of a module, and these are the permissions that the user has, right, on that module. So if I say we also have like a preference module, and this user can perform things like reading, like deletion or stuff like that. Okay, you can delete your preferences. Okay, now I'm just giving an example, by the way. So if I come in here to say user, and I say user dot sorry, if I say objects, okay, object.entries, and I then pass in, the user object right there, console.log. Now, if I go ahead and remember, I need to say user.roles, by the way, but let's start from here. So user yeah, just the user, it's able to, pass that into that is able to basically give me the key value pairs, right? And of course also define the properties that is found within those keys. So for example, preference holds an array, right? Role holds an array. So if I say user dot roles, for example, now that would also give us the detail of roles, right? So you see now it's telling us, oh, so we have auth. Auth actually contains read and update permission. We have preference, it contains read and deletion, right? It's easy for me to now say, all right, so now that I've gotten the detail of now that I've gotten the detail of the roles, what else do I probably want to check? So I probably want to check for, let me comment on this. I probably want to check at this point if this particular item includes um, maybe I want to check if it includes deletion. I want to perform an action. I want to know if I should be able to delete, right? So I probably want to, use this other method I have here that we've checked already, which is, the includes, right? So I can proceed to probably say, okay, let's check the preference. And I go as far as I'm going to get an array. Remember, I'm going to get an array for the preference, okay? If I run this, I'm going to get an array, as you can see, read and, deletion, right? So if I go ahead and, check if, this preference, item includes deletion, right? It will tell me, true or false if it actually includes deletion. And from there, I should be able to, use the response I get, from true or false to proceed with my, action in my code. So if it has deletion, then I should be able to delete. If it doesn't have deletion, I should probably return a response that says you don't have the permission to delete, right? So it makes it easier, rather than trying to do a lot of, loops and, check some of the nested objects you have within those other objects, okay? I hope that makes sense, but don't worry. By the time we dive into core backend development with JavaScript and Node.js, you would see me do some of these things, and you would get a better understanding of what I'm trying to achieve here. Okay, so we have this. We have the ability to perform a combination of using the rest and the spread properties for object literals in the ECMAScript 9, which is ECMAScript 2018, basically, right? So we can do things like creating a new variable right here, a new constant, by the way, right? And then we also we are expecting like some sort of unlimited number of params, right? Now the thing about this is you can apply this as you can see, this is a spread property, by the way. This is not unlimited param. Sorry, that was a mistake. Unlimited param is when you have this within a function, right? This is not a function. This is just a constant. And what this is trying to say is it will print out. You can print out the value of a, and every other item here will be appended, into that spread, right? So we can actually proceed to use this for some sort of destructuring. So you see, if I go ahead and log rests, right, it gives us the value of b and c, because b and c was not actually a was not added to rest. Okay, so it gives us the value of b and c. If we have even more values, so long we have already defined the initial the initial like a or b or c, every other item that was not defined in the const in this object, right, would then be passed into that rest spread operator. Okay, so let me go ahead and paste this here. Let's paste this here. So if I have like even a third item, maybe like D, right? Let's say D has the value of 5. So long, okay, so if I go ahead and say maybe B, for example. Now, so long the other items were not, passed into this, destructuring pattern that we are trying to create, it will all be passed into this particular spread, right? So if I say give me A, it's going to give me 1. If I say give me B, it's going to give me a 2. And then if I say give me rest, which is the rest of the items, right? This means the rest of the items. It's going to basically give me 3 and 5, which is of course C and D, because we did not intentionally define that within this, destructuring parameter here. Okay, we did not define that. All right. So I hope that makes sense. Now we also have array.prototype.flat, which basically flattens an array to a specified depth. We'll cover this in a different class. We'll cover the details of this in a different class. What this is basically trying to do is, flatten. You take a look at this. We have nested arrays here, right? So we have nested arrays, and if you decide to flatten this by 2, it is basically trying to, take off, some of the nesting, at least, in depth, right? So it's basically going to perform that flattening down to the in depth that you specify, right? At this point, we specify 2, which means we flatten the first one. We basically end up taking off. The array that you have internally. That's the first step. Second step is, of course, you take off the second one, right? And at the end of the day, you have a single, outer array with the entire value in there, 1, 2, 3, right? So it's going to perform that flattening based on the amount of, outer arrays you have. And if you have like an additional layer of an outer array, it's of course going to flatten up to the point where you still have 3. Okay, we'll dive into this in a different conversation. And yeah, I think I'm going to stop here for now. You can basically read up the remaining materials. So big int in ES11, we have the ability to basically create a big int, which would represent integers larger than the this scale that we have right here. Now, optional chaining. Optional chaining is when you have an object and you are trying to check, or because you think that that object would come with a specific a specific key, but you're not very sure, right? So in order to avoid having that error, you chain with the optional pattern where you use the question mark, right? So this is what we might be expecting. Now we're not 100% sure, right? And because we're not 100% sure, we want to make sure that while we are trying to grab that value, if it doesn't exist, our code doesn't crash. Our code doesn't crash at runtime. Okay, so now we started by saying, okay, object one, uh, check if there is A. I mean, there might be A, right? Check if there is B after, I mean, check if B is found under A. Now, of course, it might be there, it might not be there. So let's make sure we are doing that, optionally, right? And finally, if B is there, then we are sure that there is C, which is why we did not, try to perform any optional chaining extra, right? So what you are seeing here is that we're trying to chain by getting the value that is found within like a parent object, but we're not 100% sure, so we do that chaining with an optional pattern. Okay, we also have the knowledge coalescing operator. This is something we have discussed before. It's a logical operator, returning its right hand side operand when the left hand side is null or undefined, right? So basically, what this is going to do, we have const foo, right, which is the constant that we're declaring, and we're saying this is equal to null, right? Except if there's a default string. Now, where this actually comes into use in an actual scenario is that you are probably writing some code, and you're saying, okay, um, this should probably result to undefined, or this should tell us that, okay, we don't actually have a null value, right? Now, except there's actually a default string. So at any point in time, if the value you get here, let's assume this is a function, right? We say call API, okay? Now, for some reasons, when you actually call that API, nothing is returned. And if nothing is returned, you want to go ahead and say, okay, probably the default should be nothing was returned. Instead of just returning null, right? We'll get this, nothing was returned. But if something is returned, then what was returned would be the value of foo. Do you understand? So I hope that makes sense. But let me see. If you have the value of call API returning something, so let's just say this is a function, right? A function, okay, and we are returning. Let's assume we're returning an object called message. Okay, hello world. Okay, hello world. I hope that makes sense. All right. So now when I call this right now, let's see what we get. Okay, I run this. Let's see what we get there. So we have the message hello world that was returned, right? But then if I go ahead to return null, which is to say I don't really have an item to return, the API currently does not have any item. So you see we have nothing was returned because this was null. And when it's null, we want to probably pass this message to tell the user, oh, nothing was actually found on the server. So this is the default message we're putting there to say when it's null, then give us this value. Okay. I hope that makes sense. We've actually, covered a lot of things and it's already past 9. Apologies for taking, additional time. I really wanted us to close out by 9 p.m. on the dot. But I hope this makes sense and I can see, okay, what's the difference between the spread and the rest operator? Okay, no, no, no. So the rest that you are seeing right there is just saying, okay, these are the rest items. Do you understand? So that's basically, it's just saying these are the rest items. Okay. So first off, we're doing the structuring, right? So we have, the spread operator. That spread operator is just used to capture the remaining items we have in the other, the remaining items we have in that array, right? So, but I think we're basically describing the same thing here. Okay, so spread operator can be used to get the values from an array. If it depends on the use case. Okay, if you're basically trying to see what exactly do we have in this array, let's try to spread an existing information into a new space, into a new array. You can use the spread operator, right? And the concept of destructuring is to say, okay, if we have some items already, let's probably destructure that into a or B or C into different variables so that each variable can actually map itself to a value, right, in that particular array or in that particular, array of objects. I hope that makes sense. All right, so that is for, who asked that question? That is for Butch Tech. I think Butchie, right? If I'm not mistaken. So Bernard said, yes, boss, because I need know this guy is my produce and filter. Yeah, okay. So you can read up before the next class. Hopefully in the next class, I think we should be taking that. Okay, so let's see. Can the knowledge coalescing be used to send uh, out error messages instead of just using the catch and throw? Well, I mean, it's a good way to send out information. I won't call that error, right? Because you got null as a response. Okay, so if you're using try and catch, it means you're probably expecting an error that can crash the runtime. Okay, that can crash the runtime or the that execution of your code. Okay, the knowledge coalescing operator is not expecting to help you solve that problem. It's basically giving you an alternative instead of getting null or undefined. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Have a wonderful evening, guys. Do well to make sure you fill the attendance forms. And yeah, I'll see you in the next class. That is tomorrow, 8 p.m. Have fun.